I knew Evan was going to be a problem the moment he slammed my laptop shut mid-call. I was sitting on the lodge deck at 6:07 a.m., sipping cold coffee and troubleshooting a faulty node replication across our backup clusters, when he marched over in a pressed polo and a look like he'd just smelled old cheese. "Are you seriously doing work here?" he barked, like the pine trees were going to file an HR complaint. I didn't flinch. I'd been on the clock since 4i, patching the East Coast cluster before their Monday traffic spike hit. He leaned in. "This isn't your personal vacation lodge, it's my father's company." I just looked at him and said, "Funny, your father called it ours." Before we go on, real quick, if you're listening and getting pulled in, don't forget to subscribe and like the video. It tells the algorithm we're worth hearing, and it keeps stories like this going. 97% of people forget to, and your support really motivates the team. All right, back to it. Raincrest Systems wasn't built on attitude or aesthetics. It was built on uptime, on code that held when clients panicked, on infrastructure no one saw but everyone depended on. That had been my job from the start. I joined when we were 10 people in a converted grain warehouse in Dayton. Marcus didn't care about titles. He cared about grit. I didn't have an MBA. I had Cisco certs, Linux scars, and a habit of sleeping beside a console during system launches. The lodge? It wasn't a resort. It was where we staged rollback environments and simulated crisis drills. Marcus and I had built it to test our disaster recovery protocols away from the noise. If you weren't around during the 2011 DNS debacle or the West Coast fiber split of 2016, maybe it looked like a spa. To me, it was a command post. Evan had only shown up in the last 3 years, loud, branded, and very convinced the company needed modern direction. He'd never shipped a single update, never monitored a failover. But he had a LinkedIn banner photo with a drone shot of downtown Chicago, so apparently that made him a visionary. After he slammed the laptop, I didn't argue. I just restarted the call on my backup device and moved to the secondary deck. I finished the migration silently. The clients never noticed the drift, because I caught it, like always. The next week, a memo went out. Remote meetings at non-designated facilities must be cleared by executive oversight. I was CC'd, along with legacy staff as a category. I didn't fight it. I kept working. I submitted the quarterly infrastructure health audit, 99.98% uptime. No mention. No thank you. Instead, Trent, Evan's hand-picked digital transformation consultant, was invited to present a roadmap to the board, half of which looked like it had been scraped from a Medium post written by ChatGPT in 2022. That was the thing with Evan. He wasn't malicious. He was convinced he knew better. That's more dangerous. 2 weeks later, I booked my usual off-grid rotation week, something Marcus and I had baked into our continuity plan years ago. A week in the lodge, fully connected but off the corporate radar, monitoring system stress during the summer surge. It had been standard for nearly a decade. But Evan responded to my calendar note with one line, "This isn't a vacation lodge. It's my father's company now." That was the moment I opened my private archive folder, the one labeled Raincrest Governance System Triggers and Clause 14B. I didn't yell. I didn't reply. I just pulled the backup drive, inserted it into the secure node I'd never documented on any internal wiki, and ran a silent integrity scan across the legacy architecture controls. Because Evan didn't know what his father and I had built. And more importantly, he had no idea who actually owned the keys. I knew the company would change without Marcus. I just didn't think it would rot from the top down in less than a week. The funeral was held at the Old Stone Chapel downtown, the same one where Marcus used to take calls from a payphone when our first data center lease was falling apart. He'd always say it had good signal and better acoustics for desperate negotiations. I sat in the second row, tucked behind his wife and brother, mostly silent. Evan arrived 20 minutes late, wearing sunglasses indoors, flanked by Trent in a navy suit that probably cost more than our first server rack. Evan didn't acknowledge me, not a nod, not a glance. He gave a little speech at the front about innovation and vision, name-dropped MIT and emerging cloud paradigms, then moved on without saying a single word about the team that had kept his father's company breathing for 2 decades. The board made it official 6 days later. Evan was the new CEO of Raincrest Systems. Marcus had left some operational guidelines, but not a formal succession lock, just principles. And Evan didn't care for principles. He cared for optics. The first email blast went out Monday morning. We're entering a new era. It sounded like a tech TED talk delivered by someone who'd never debugged a network cascade failure. The second email stripped the remote work policy. On-site collaboration is non-negotiable. The third, every decision around core systems would now be reviewed by the Office of Digital Architecture, meaning Trent. Trent, who once asked me in front of the entire infrastructure team what a load balancer did. It was like watching someone hand a shotgun to a toddler and tell them to go reorganize the vault. I tried. For the first week, I sent polite updates, flagged potential redundancies, forwarded Marcus's old documentation on system interdependencies. No one replied. Trent scheduled 2 alignment meetings, which consisted of him screen sharing a Canva deck about synergy stacks and telling the security lead that firewalls are kind of a boomer thing. So when I sent my routine calendar hold, 1 week, remote, scheduled as always, I expected maybe a raised eyebrow. Instead, Evan sent a reply that felt like it had been typed with clenched teeth. "This isn't a vacation lodge. It's my father's company now." I read it 3 times, then once more, and I felt something I hadn't in years. Not anger, not fear, just a quiet click, like a switch being flipped deep in my chest. Because Evan clearly hadn't read the continuity clauses, the ones his father and I drafted 15 years ago, notarized and embedded across both the legal and technical foundations of Raincrest's architecture. Clause 14b. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't flashy. It was a failsafe, a governance trigger written during the Great Data Migration, when Marcus asked, "What happens if I'm not here and the next leader doesn't understand the systems?" I'd written the clause into our infrastructure charter and the digital bylaws. It tied architectural authority to the original architect, not the CEO. If the systems entered a drift state or were mismanaged during an executive transition, control reverted silently to the person who'd built them. Me. It had been signed by Marcus and witnessed by the firm's general counsel. It didn't activate often. It wasn't meant to. But when it did, it changed everything. I opened my private folder, dusted off the PDF scans, the notarized timestamp logs, the chain of trust certificate, and the key set reference sheet. Then I did something even quieter. I logged into the console Marcus and I had called the spine, the oldest kernel still wired to the original governance hooks. I ran a passive check. There it was. Authority deviation detected, executive transition, plus unauthorized access path. I didn't trigger anything yet. I didn't need to. The system had already begun watching. And Evan? He was still busy redesigning the homepage with Trent. Font first, firewall later. Let him. The infrastructure doesn't yell. It doesn't argue. It just waits. And then it reminds you who wrote the rules. Marcus was always planning 5 moves ahead, not out of paranoia, but survival instinct. When you've been bootstrapped, bank finessed, and burned by 2 different partners before the age of 40, you start assuming the next fire is already smoldering under your desk. He didn't want a shiny kill switch or some doomsday vault buried in a mountain. He wanted something boring, invisible. Resilient enough to sleep through chaos, he said, but smart enough to wake up when the wrong hands touch the wrong wire. So we built it. Not all at once. It grew in layers, over years, under updates, across migrations. A mesh of embedded permissions, buried root certificates, and biometric lockouts that no org chart could rewrite. It wasn't sexy. It didn't have a name like Zero Trust or Sentinel Grid. It was quiet, stubborn, and relentless. Marcus called it the emergency brake. And in the middle of that brake was a principle, not a product. When everything goes sideways, authority defaults to the person who understands the system's pulse. Me. We tied it into hardware, into audit logs, into identity resolution services that Trent couldn't even pronounce, let alone reconfigure. One layer was biometric, a thumbprint vault in a fireproof safe. One was cryptographic, a key pair generated on an offline air-gapped laptop I kept wrapped in copper mesh. The last was operational. Only the architect who completed the founding continuity cycle could authorize privilege escalations during a governance conflict. That cycle was mine. I'd closed it in 2012 after the Tokyo data center rebuild. Marcus notarized it with a tech-side affidavit. His general counsel signed it, scanned it, and registered it with our founding operational bylaws. Clause 14B. Final authority in system matters resides with the original architect upon conditions of drift, conflict, or founder incapacitation. Marcus hadn't just trusted me. He designed the company to trust me more than any future heir. He once told me during a flood drill, "Vision is great, but someone has to keep the pipes from bursting while the heir is on a yacht." Now, here we were. Marcus was gone. The yacht had docked, and Evan had rolled in, firing off Slack memos about modernizing the stack, unaware that every system he touched was quietly logging him as a governance anomaly. The keys? I still had them. One was etched into a drive that had never been connected to the internet. One was printed as a hex string in an old moleskin notebook, stored behind a photo of my niece's third-grade science fair trophy. The last one, the temporal trigger, had just activated. Executive transition confirmed, the system log read. Governance anomaly detected, clause 14B, watch enabled. I didn't pull rank. I didn't declare anything. I just sat back, finished my tea, and started monitoring the logs for escalation drift. Evan had no idea what was ticking under his feet. Trent was busy hosting Slack huddles titled things like Reimagining Core Systems. They thought I was legacy tech, fossil code, the woman who wouldn't let go of the old ways. They didn't realize I was the old way, and I'd written the rules that kept the new ones from burning the house down. The brake hadn't pulled yet, but it was listening. And when it fired, it wouldn't be loud. It would be final. It started with a firewall policy change that looked harmless. A standard config update pushed in via a cloud dashboard Trent barely knew how to navigate. But I saw it immediately. They'd flipped the external logging threshold to warning instead of critical, which meant if someone were probing us from the outside, even persistently, the system wouldn't scream. It would whisper. Maybe. If Trent happened to check the dashboard between his networking lunches and whatever podcast mic he'd bought last week, then they disabled local syslog redundancy. Too old school, Trent had said, pitching his favorite phrase. We're streamlining. No, what they were doing was unraveling. The real mess began when they deployed the SaaS-based compliance suite, shiny, expensive, and optimized for everything except our architecture. No load path vetting, no compatibility analysis. They plugged it into the API core like a USB lamp into a toaster. And when it started spitting out conflicts with our telemetry feeds, they sent a Jira ticket. To me. I replied, flagging the issue. 2 minutes later, Evan replied, all, tagging legal. He's optional. System ops can go through Trent now. The word optional hit like a shard of glass in the throat. I didn't even respond. There was no point. But the system did. At 6:12 a.m. the next morning, my phone buzzed with a quiet, familiar vibration. 3 short pulses, 1 long, the protocol alert, the one that only fired under one very specific condition. I tapped into the spy node and read the message. Privilege, drift detected, clause 14B, triggers engaged. Below that, a second line followed. Last will flag, founder death confirmed, governance authority transfer pending. I closed the laptop and just sat still. It was happening. The system, my system, had detected an executive override pattern inconsistent with historical operational continuity. That meant the architecture was now entering observation mode. The protocols were quietly logging every change to critical infrastructure. If certain thresholds were crossed, lateral permission misuse, critical bypass attempts, unauthorized credential injections, it would escalate. And if the escalation criteria were met, control transferred, not to a role, to me. I pulled up the governance chain audit view. Trent had triggered 3 warnings in the last 24 hours, one for elevated access to the legacy load balancer, one for pushing an unverified compliance module to prod, and one for attempting to rewrite a DNS failover protocol that was hard-coded to deny access without biometric confirmation. I didn't stop him. That's the thing about bad architecture decisions. The best way to teach someone they're wrong is to let them push the button, watch it spark, and hand them the extinguisher after the room fills with smoke. By Thursday, 3 departments had opened tickets about intermittent delays. Our DevOps team, who knew better, started asking in hushed Slack channels if something had changed. But no one confronted Trent. Evan had made it clear, speak up and your legacy. Trent sent out a Friday memo. Great first week of progress. Realigning our architecture with modern best practices. Phase 2 begins Monday. Phase 2, Lord, help us. I didn't sleep that night. Not from stress, but from calculation, watching, logging, preparing. I wasn't going to sabotage anything. I didn't need to. I'd already built the immune system, and now the virus was trying to rewrite the DNA. The antibodies had been activated, and I had just become patient zero for the cure. 2 months. That's how long the system waited. Watching, logging, building its case in silence while Evan strutted through all hands meetings with a forced smirk and a fresh rotation of designer sneakers. Trent was still giving monthly architecture update presentations in the boardroom, usually featuring recycled buzzwords, abstract diagrams shaped like infinity signs, and a blank stare when asked about why half the East Coast node telemetry had gone dark for 7 minutes on July 12th. And me? I kept working, quietly, diligently, taking notes, saving logs, watching their version of progress crumble beneath the surface tension. And when the privilege drift exceeded the final threshold, the system didn't shut down. It just waited for the will. Marcus's death had triggered a legal review, standard estate and corporate trust processing. But what Evan didn't understand was that Marcus had always believed in parallel structures, operational authority and legal authority. The former I already had. The latter? That was about to be read aloud in front of 2 board members, 3 attorneys, the CFO, Evan, Trent, and me. The room was pure glass and chrome, a design Evan had personally approved to give Raincrest Systems a Silicon Valley edge. It felt more like a vacuum. No warmth, just echo and ego. The lawyer, a thin man with tortoiseshell glasses and the emotional cadence of a tax form, read through the routine. Asset transfers, investment portfolios, charitable distributions, shares, property, executive authority designations. Then he flipped a page, cleared his throat, and slowed his pace. There is one provision flagged for special attention as it pertains to corporate governance continuity, he said, glancing up, in matters of system architecture and digital security. The room shifted. Evan leaned forward. Final authority shall rest with the individual who originally designed, implemented, and maintained the operational core of the Raincrest Systems infrastructure. He stopped, scanning the page, then reached for a stapled addendum, which is explicitly defined in Addendum B as Mr. Colin Avery. Evan tapped his pen once, then again. Who's Colin? He asked flatly, looking around like someone had just lost a name tag at a conference. No one answered, but I saw it. The slow rotation of eyes, from the lawyer to me, from Trent to me, from the board members to me. Even the CFO, who had once complimented Trent's PowerPoint animations, stared at me like he was seeing a ghost crawl out of the server room. I didn't move, didn't flinch. I just tilted my head slightly. Colin Avery, my legal name, full name, the one only HR, Marcus, and the founding paperwork had ever used. Everyone else just knew me as Avery, short, quiet, never in the spotlight. The woman who fixed things, the one you called when your access broke, when your query failed, when your backup didn't restore. Invisible until essential. Marcus had known exactly what he was doing. He buried the title not just in the bylaws, but in his will, tying the legal authority to the person, not the role. A board member finally broke the silence. Does that supersede current operational controls? The lawyer gave a small, neutral shrug. This clause activates in the event of founder death, confirmed privilege drift, and unresolved governance conflict. According to the digital logs, he gestured to a printed folder. All conditions have been met, which means that, as of today, final authority over Raincrest's digital infrastructure belongs to... He looked directly at me. Ms. Avery. Evan snorted. That's absurd. She hasn't even presented at a single strategy session since I took over. Another board member leaned forward. Yet every time something breaks, her name shows up in the resolution logs, doesn't it? No one laughed. No one moved. I finally spoke. Just once. This wasn't about strategy sessions, it was about continuity. Then I went still again. Let them read the rest. Let them catch up. Because the system had already made its decision. And now the will had spoken. The boardroom wasn't the same one from the will reading. This one was smaller, colder, deep inside our Tier 3 facility in Columbus. The real nerve center. The one no one in marketing ever tours because it looks too much like what it is. The last stop before digital collapse. The walls buzzed faintly with cooling systems. A red light blinked over the main console. The governance kernel had activated. I got there 5 minutes early. The outer doors scanned my badge, then my retina. Inside, the security gate pulsed blue as it confirmed my biometric profile against the embedded architect's signature logged nearly 2 decades ago. The system didn't ask for Evan. He hadn't even been added to the kernel's trust tree. That was the point. I laid 3 things on the table. A printed copy of Clause 14b with Marcus's signature, the original founding bylaws with the continuity clause highlighted, and the notarized architecture diagrams that map the operational escalation paths, complete with the hard-coded final authority signature block. Mine. Evan arrived exactly on the hour, flanked by Trent and a visibly uncomfortable attorney from outside counsel. The CTO, now relegated to a ceremonial title since Trent's arrival, lingered in the doorway like a man hoping not to be noticed. I didn't rise, didn't perform. I simply tapped the folder in front of me. "I'm not here to argue," I said quietly, "but you've introduced vulnerabilities into core systems, ones that violate not just protocol, but legal governance. The rollback has already started." Trent scoffed. "What rollback? The systems are running fine." I slid a page across the table, a forensic readout from the compliance tool they'd implemented. The time-stamped report showed 5 data loss events in the past 3 weeks. Silent corruptions. Minor now, but fatal if they hit production. He stopped scoffing. Evan leaned forward, trying to regain ground. "Okay, let's just say there was a clause. Can't we override it? The board can authorize a temporary exception." "No," I cut in. Calm, final. "The system is already in fallback protocol. Governance authority is hard-coded to decline any request lacking verified architect approval during a Clause 14b event." The legal rep flipped through his packet. "She's not wrong," he muttered, adjusting his glasses. "The architecture documents we found, they're airtight. This protocol is activated, irreversible, and backed by founding authority. If we attempt to override it, we risk triggering a security cascade." Evan's voice cracked. "This is sabotage." "No," I said. "This is a safeguard. Sabotage would have been letting you keep running blind." He turned red, opened his mouth, closed it again. The board member from legal joined the call late and asked one question. "Are we at risk of system failure if we don't follow fallback?" "Yes," I said. "And if we follow fallback?" "Systems stabilize, vulnerabilities close, continuity is restored. Then proceed." Evan's chair creaked as he shifted uncomfortably. Trent stared at his lap, saying nothing now that things didn't involve clip art and buzzwords. I reached into my folder and pulled out the rollback script trigger. Not digital, printed, time-locked with a QR hash that could only be authorized using the biometric token embedded in the governance kernel. I held it up. "This doesn't reboot the company," I said. "It just stops the bleeding." Legal nodded. "Authority confirmed." The screen on the wall dimmed. The emergency console came online, and the system, my system, waited for me, not Evan. Me. He had been so busy renaming folders and updating mission statements, he never stopped to ask what was running underneath it all. Who kept the lights on, who'd built the spine of the company while he was still touring undergrad incubators and collecting inspirational quotes from failed startups. "I don't want your job," I said as I placed the script in the scanner. "I want the systems to stop breaking." And with one soft beep, rollback began. It didn't crash. It corrected. Evan didn't take it quietly. As the rollback protocols restored the real architecture, the one Marcus and I had stress-tested in 100 disaster scenarios, Evan exploded, first with denial, then with fury. "She's sabotaging us," he shouted, standing and pointing at me like I'd shorted the power grid with a paperclip. "This is insubordination. She's legacy staff. She's bitter because she wasn't promoted." He kept going, pacing the length of the room like a caged algorithm glitching in a loop. "My father didn't intend for this. She manipulated him. This clause, this whole thing, it's fraudulent. It undermines executive authority." The attorney barely looked up from his paperwork. The clause has 3 independent signatures and a registered timestamp from 2012. Notarized, authenticated, and embedded in the original system governance logs. Your father didn't just intend it, he wrote it. Trent, bless him, made one final attempt to rescue his reputation. Actually, I don't think the clause is relevant anymore, he said, trying to spin authority back his way. This is about vision, not old code. I just tilted the emergency console toward him. The screen displayed a single message. Access denied. You are not authorized to alter core systems during a Clause 14b protocol event. Trent stared at it, then at Evan, then back at the board. I can't even access the console anymore. Silence. A senior board member broke it with a calm, surgical tone. Ms. Avery, what do you recommend? I handed them a 2-page summary. Nothing dramatic, just facts. A security remediation plan to close the holes Trent had introduced. A list of redundant controls I'd quietly preserved. A suggestion to restore the pre-existing role alignment that Evan had dismantled. And one final recommendation. Temporary removal of Mr. Evan Raincrest from operational authority pending board review and system stabilization. I didn't even look at Evan when I said it. I looked at the system status log, the one showing our load balancers had returned to equilibrium. Error rate down, latency normalized, external probes being flagged again. Order. The board voted within 10 minutes, unanimously. Evan didn't even stay to hear the count. He stormed out, muttering something about contacting his father's estate lawyer and filing a grievance with the board. No one followed him. When the meeting adjourned, I walked out through the side entrance past the secondary access corridor that led toward the parking lot. That's where I saw him, pacing just outside the glass exit doors. He looked small, not physically. Evan had always been taller than Marcus, but diminished. His blazer wrinkled from stress, his tie hanging crooked. He wasn't shouting anymore, just standing still with his hands on his hips and that rattled, fragile look of someone whose story had just stopped making sense. He looked up as I passed. His eyes were red, his jaw clenched. A million things unsaid behind that stare. I met it for a beat, then kept walking. Didn't blink, didn't speak. Didn't need to, because Marcus had always told me the people who scream about control are usually the ones who lost it before they realized it was never theirs. And now, Evan finally understood what he'd inherited wasn't a throne, it was a system, and it had never once bowed to ego. The vote had barely cooled when the shift began, not flashy. No press release, no ceremonial transfer of power with Evan fake smiling through a handshake photo. Just a sequence of very specific changes, logged silently into the very systems he'd tried to hijack. First, the board reinstated our original protocols. Every policy Marcus and I had designed for resilience, traceability, and sanity. The rollback scripts finished execution. Audit logs flushed and revalidated. Kernel integrity checks passed. Alert chains reset to their original thresholds, which meant, for the first time in 6 weeks, we were actually catching problems before clients called us. Second, my formal role was updated. No more ambiguity. Director of Infrastructure and Continuity Governance. Not flashy, not even new. It was the function I'd always performed, just now with codified oversight and an explicit charter signed by the board. My authority was now not just embedded in the architecture, it was embedded in the org chart. A governance node, permanent and untouchable. Trent, gone. No drama, no farewell email, just a quiet line in the transition report. Contractor engagement terminated. Assets revoked. Systems access rescinded. A new CTO arrived 2 weeks later. Maya Linton, sharp, even-tempered, and refreshingly unafraid to say, "I don't know," in a room full of people paid to pretend otherwise. She didn't try to impress anyone with jargon. She asked me where the real risks were, listened, took notes, ran ideas by engineering before sending memos to legal. When she said, "Can I sit in on your next rollback simulation?" I knew the grid had officially changed hands. Evan, meanwhile, was granted a wellness sabbatical to realign with the company's operational mission. The quote came from HR, no one fought it. The transition report was clinical but lethal. Repeated unauthorized architecture overrides, delegation of security responsibilities to unqualified third parties, and the most damning phrase of all, failure to consult designated authority as defined under Clause 14B. He still technically owned shares, but power? That had been dissolved the moment the colonel ignored his fingerprint. And me? I went back to my rotation schedule, woke up before dawn, brewed cheap coffee, stepped out onto the deck of the lodge with a fleece over my shoulders and a laptop balanced on my knees. The logs ran clean. The console blinked in that steady, rhythmic way that told me the heartbeat was back. One alert, a server load anomaly in Asia Pacific, resolved itself before I had to touch it. I took 2 calls that morning, one from the new CTO asking if we could start documenting Clause 14B protocols for onboarding. One from a junior engineer who just wanted to ask how the fallback logic handled simultaneous elevation requests. He apologized for bothering me. I told him never to apologize for being curious. Then I went quiet again, watching the grid, listening to the hum of systems doing exactly what they were designed to do: run, recover, repeat. No headlines, no fire drills, no screaming matches in glass boardrooms. Just a grid that respected the woman who built it, and a lodge that stayed quiet. Operational. Mine. The new Raincrest site went live on a Sunday night, timed to coincide with a partnered announcement and a fresh round of investor courting. It had all the modern trimmings: slick gradients, bold sans serif fonts, case study loops that autoplayed quietly, a smiling executive team now minus one familiar face. But it was the footer that caught my attention. Not in bold, not even in white, just a faint line in soft gray almost blending into the page's edge. Core Systems Architecture, Clause 14B, Governance Authority, C. Avery. No link, no pop-up, no fanfare, just presence. It sat there like a watermark only the observant would catch. Legal insisted on including it. Something about transparency and acknowledgement of internal authority structures post-transition. I didn't push for it. I didn't even know they were going to add it, but there it was, the entire war, resolved in 8 words. I didn't screenshot it, didn't save the HTML, I didn't have to, because every line of that architecture still lived in the system heartbeat logs I read each morning before the world woke up. The rollback protocol was on standby now, fully dormant but watching. Access requests flowed cleanly through the new gatekeepers. Maya and her team sent real updates, short, functional, respectful. The alert feed was quiet. The lodge was quieter. That Thursday night, I was in the lounge at HQ for an overnight push, a data center reroute in Munich. Nothing major, just a little dance with the nodes to optimize latency. The junior devs had ordered Thai food and were troubleshooting a permissions issue they'd introduced in a half-baked automation test. Around 11:30, one of them wandered into the lounge while I was sipping the last of my coffee, the kind that tastes like burnt ambition but keeps the logs spinning. He hovered near the edge of the room before stepping closer. Probably 24. New badge. Hoodie with the company's old Hex logo on it, the one I drew on a napkin in 2007. Hey, he started. That line on the site about Clause 14B, is that real? I looked up. Met his eyes. He wasn't mocking. He was curious, sincere. You really built the whole thing? He asked. I smiled. Not a big one, just enough. Not the whole thing, I said, holding up my cup. Just the part they didn't respect, until it locked them out. He blinked, grinned a little, nodded. I want to build something like that someday. I raised the cup in a quiet toast and said nothing else. He left. And I sat there, watching the real-time logs flicker in perfect cadence, the system sinking like breath. No vengeance, no gloating, no flame war or victory lap. Just one clause, buried deep. Just one architect, never removed. And one locked door that opened only when the right person stepped forward. Not louder, not flashier. Just ready, just steady, just me.